Excellent. Okay, so we are going to move on to Damian Beil. And Damian is joining us from the University of Michigan. He's an expert in game theory. Damian is a professor of business administration, and he's the area chair for technology and operations at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. Damian is well published, and I certainly recommend you reach out and see some of his publications on some of the sourcing topics that he's published. And with that, Damian, welcome. Are you out there?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Thank you for joining this morning.
Happy to.
Great. So Damian, I have a few questions lined up to discuss with you, and we'll kind of work through those. We've got about 10 minutes, and I know that everyone is anxious to hear from you today.
Sure.
Great. Okay, so with that, let's kick it off. Game theory and behavioral science have become a very hot topic, and especially among procurement teams. Why do you think that is?
It's a good question. I think Jim was touching on some of it when he was referencing what's been going on in the past few years with the pandemic and the challenges that we are all facing with trying to figure out how to get supply and rethink ways that we interact with vendors. I think that's a big part of it. I guess I've been in kind of the game theory space for decades, and if I look kind of back at what game theory is, in my view, it's kind of a cool way to create a model of a strategic interaction. So, people at the beginning of the call were talking about their favorite board games like Settlers of Catan, or Jim mentioned Blackjack. That's a very strategic game. If you can write down the rules of a game or an interaction, and you write down the types of decisions that people can make and what incentives they have and what beliefs they may hold, then you can use game theory to make predictions about the outcomes of whatever that strategic or game situation is. So historically, it's been pretty helpful to do what if analyses. What if I change the number of vendors, or what if I change the rules by which my vendors are interacting with me? I think that's always been there. But I think, if I look back 20 years, what people were using game theory for in procurement was mostly for like huge, significant auctions. Think of like the government auctioning off a whole bunch of spectrum, and they've got a bunch of bidders, which are companies. These companies hire a bunch of nerds, like economists, who come in and advise them. And the government has their own nerd team, and they're being advised on how to create the market. That doesn't scale very well, but I think with more data and more processing power, we can kind of use some of those game theory concepts and execute it using data and computational abilities that we didn't have 20 years ago. I think that really helps us roll it out a little bit broader. And with the pandemic, as we mentioned earlier, I think there's a growing appetite for that kind of opportunity.
Absolutely. And we're absolutely seeing that as well. So that's fantastic. Thanks for that, Damian. And just another question. We have all heard of the prisoner's dilemma. Can you explain what it is and how it relates to the concept of making an anchor offer? And also in the process of communicating that with suppliers, how that affects our suppliers.
Sure, I'll give it a shot. So the prisoner's dilemma typically is explained as follows. Like, you have two people that were arrested for a crime, and the police are not dumb, and they hold these suspects in different cells, okay? So they can't talk to each other. And they go one at a time to each suspect. They go to the first suspect and they say, hey, we think you did this, but if you confess and you rat out the other suspect, we'll give you a lighter sentence. On the other hand, if the other suspect, if you deny that you did it, and we go to the other suspect and they confess and rat you out, you're going to get a much worse sentence. So it's a way to play suspects off each other. We know that, like, this has been in the news lately with all of the trials, using RICO approaches where you try to get the low-level people to flip. This is kind of like a challenge that a suspect would have, is whether or not they should flip in order to get a lighter sentence. Okay, it may sound weird that this could relate to like an anchor offer, but really, I guess if you give a vendor an offer to, like an offer that says, hey, you could have the contract at this price, or we'll take it to market, they've got a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma because they know that they could either jump on this offer today and they could secure the contract, or they could roll the dice and take it to market and maybe lose the contract, or maybe win it, or maybe win it at a different profit point than they could have had. So it's similar in the sense that, you're relying on people's risk aversion. You're relying on people's, I guess, in a sourcing setting, their loss aversion. They don't want to lose contract opportunity. And you are also relying on people's beliefs about what they think the other suspect, or what they think the other supplier may do with the same offer on the table.
Interesting. Yeah, that's certainly an interesting concept and how it plays out. Appreciate that response there, Dame. Very, very interesting. One last question. We've got a couple minutes left. You've advised many companies on the use of designing procurement processes, especially when it comes to game theory. What's one specific story you could share and that helped really drive a very successful business outcome?
One of the most interesting, in my opinion, cases, and this is an example that I use in my teaching when I teach a class on strategic sourcing, relates to something pretty fundamental, and it's about creating a functioning supply market. For context, it was a company in the automotive space that bought a lot of different items, but a lot of it was highly engineered components. And they had hired a consulting firm to come in and market test a whole bunch of products, which the consultant did. They pocketed their fee, they left. And the problem that the company faced was they were unable to consummate, they were unable to execute a lot of these resourced contracts. And the CPO really wanted to turn this around. He was determined that they would find a way to use market testing to their advantage, because they really had not done a whole bunch of effective market tests with their products. They were making really good margins. They didn't have a lot of competitors at the time. They were facing new competition, and they knew that they needed to control their costs. And what they found when they were running these additional auctions to try it, give it a go again, they were unable to really get much traction with the vendors. It seemed like the vendors were not really biting. They didn't get much movement in the auctions. And they were scratching their heads going like, well, maybe we need to make the auction run longer. Maybe people were busy. Maybe we should allow it to be a multi-day thing. And people in China couldn't submit their bids because, they didn't realize that this was like really going to be an important thing where they had to give us the bids or they're going to lose the contract. From a game theory point of view, it was totally obvious what was going on. They didn't have a credible market due to the fact that in the past they would get these bids, but they wouldn't consummate the deals afterwards. They had a really complicated resourcing process with the sourcing board that would veto a lot of the potential new contracts when they were doing a resourcing. So what we did is basically show them the game theory perspective here, which is you got to create a credible market. You have to choose a category for which you can really clearly commit to resourcing the business, and that as a first step will create kind of a credible commitment to the vendors, and they will know, and you will have to execute on the promise that you have to win the bid in order to win the contract. I think from a game theory point of view, it seems pretty obvious, but I think a lot of times when you're in the soup, when you're in the thick of it, it's kind of hard to think a couple steps ahead, and it's hard to think about how the supplier is going to think about what you're doing and think about their perspective, really put yourself in their shoes. And that fundamentally is what game theory is about. And anybody who plays Risk and anybody who plays Settlers of Catan and anybody who deals with strategy and board games knows that you have to kind of think from the other player's perspective, but it's not always easy to do.
Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic, Damian. We certainly appreciate your time and your insight. It was